deck I'm going to be breaking down is one of my personal favorite decks. It's the partner pairing of Alena, Kessig Trapper, and Livio, Oathsworn Sentinel. Alena is 4 and a red for a 4/3 legendary creature, Human Scout with first strike. Activate ability of tap to add an amount of red mana equal to the greatest power among creatures you control that enter the battlefield this turn. The other commander is Livio. Livio is 1 and a white for a 2/2 legendary creature, Human Knight, with 2 activated abilities. The first activated ability is 1 and a white. Choose another target creature. Its controller may exile it with an Aegis counter on it. The second activated ability is 2 and a white. To tap, return all exiled cards with Aegis counters on them to the battlefield under their owner's control. So the main focus of this deck is that it's a Boros creature deck, trying to take advantage of enter the battlefield effects, while also trying to keep those creatures very large so that we can use Alena's ability to make a lot of red mana. This commander can get out of hand very fast, snowballs quickly off of a few draw spells and a few large creatures, and maybe an untap effect too. Before we talk about any of the exciting cards in the deck, we're going to have to break down the ramp package. The ramp package is mostly comprised of just artifacts, things like Soul Ring, Arcane Signet, Mind Stone, Felwar Stone, Wayfarer's Bauble, Boros Signet. I have included a couple larger artifacts like Gilded Lotus and Thran Dynamo. 2 ramp spells that I really like in this deck are Patriarch's Seal and Loyal Warhound. These 2 synergize with both of our commanders pretty well. Patriarch's Seal taps to add 1 mana of any color. You can pay 1, tap to untap target legendary creature you control. Since both of our commanders have tap abilities, this makes a great ramp piece and a great value piece, allowing us to use our commander's abilities multiple times in one turn. Loyal Warhound is 1 and a white for a 3/1. It has Vigilance, and when it enters the battlefield, if an opponent controls more lands than you, search your library for a basic Plains card, put it on the battlefield tapped, then shuffle. It's pretty common that we're going to get this ETB to actually trigger. We're not playing green, so there's not a lot of ways for us to put extra lands into play. So this is going to trigger quite often. It also synergizes with both of our commanders. Loyal Warhound has an enter the battlefield effect, so we can exile it from play with Livio, return it to play, ramp extra that way. And it also has 3 power for a 2-mana creature, which is very, very good with Alena. It becomes not a dead draw late in the game, comes down for 2 mana. It can make our commander tap for 3 mana, which is very important. Another really fantastic artifact in this deck is Moonsilver Key. It has pay 1, tap, sacrifice Moonsilver Key to search your library for an artifact with a mana ability or a basic land card, reveal it, shuffle. One of the main reasons that this card is so good is that early game we can play it, maybe go get a basic land, maybe get a Soul Ring. If we're looking for a lot more mana generation, we can go get a Thran Dynamo or Gilded Lotus. However, it also gets 2 other really key pieces to the deck. It can go get our Patriarch's Seal to untap our commanders to allow us to use their abilities multiple times, but it also goes and it can get 2 cards that read very bad, but in this deck are super, super useful. Urn of Godfire and Energy Refractor. These cards are very important to our game plan. When we make a lot of red mana with Alena, sometimes it's really hard to cast our white spells. These 2 artifacts can help us turn some of that red mana into white mana to keep our mana fixing good. Urn of Godfire, it's 1 and it has an ability to pay 2, add 1 mana of any color, so we can turn 2 red into a white mana and vice versa. It also has 6 tap, sacrifice it, destroy target creature enchantment. I really like that this card is so versatile because while it's a very, very large cost, it allows our Moonsilver Key to be able to search for removal in a very desperate situation during a game. And if you draw it by itself and you don't need its fixing, has another use. Energy Refractor costs 1 more than Urn of Godfire. When it enters the battlefield, draw a card. So this card's never really a dead draw because it always cantrips itself. and then it has the exact same mana filtering ability as Urn of Godfire. The next group of artifacts I'm going to talk about are all utility artifacts. The first one is Panharmonicon. If an artifact or creature entering the battlefield causes a triggered ability of a permanent you control to trigger, that ability triggers an additional time. Since we're working with a lot of creatures with enter the battlefield effects, this card's fantastic. Doubles up on those, gives us a lot of value for a pretty low cost 4-mana artifact. The next two both work with our commanders. We have Battle Mage's Bracers. Equipped creature has haste. Whenever ability of an equipped creature is activated, if it isn't a mana ability, you may pay 1. If you do, copy that ability. You may choose new targets for the copy. This artifact is mostly going to be used on Livio because Alena's activated ability is a mana ability, so we're unable to copy it. However, if we're in a scenario where we really need to give Alena haste, we can do that by equipping it for 2. Otherwise, most of the time it's going to be on Livio. Puppet Strings is another good one. 3 mana for an artifact. You can pay 2, tap the artifact to tap or untap target creature. We're most of the time going to be using this to untap either one of our commanders. There are a couple scenarios where you can tap down an opponent before they go to combat, preventing an attack, but it's mostly used on the commanders. And then we have Swiftfoot Boots, gives our commanders hexproof, and it gives them haste. Haste is probably the more important part. While the protection is nice, it's very useful being able to use both of our commanders' abilities the turn we play them. We also have 1,000 Year Elixir, 3-mana artifact. You can activate abilities of creatures you control as though those creatures had haste. So, both of our commanders have activated abilities, can use them as though they had haste. Also has pay 1, tap it to untap target creature. So, both aspects of this artifact are very useful in this deck. We also have Lightning Greaves, very similar to Swiftfoot Boots, gives us that protection. Also, more importantly, gives us haste, but at a equip cost of 0, so very low impact on our turn. Moving on to some enchantments, we have Rising of the Day. It's an enchantment for 2 and a red. Creatures you control have haste, and legendary creatures you control get +1/+0. The reason that this card is so good in this deck is 1, it gives all of our creatures haste, including our commanders, which is the most important part of this card. However, it has a nice added bonus that it gives legendary creatures we control +1/+0. That's nice because if we have this down and we play Alena, Alena now has haste. However, Alena also has +1/+0, so they're a 5/3. Which means they come down and they replace their entire mana cost immediately, allowing us to play another card right after that. Another card that's super awesome is Mirror March. 5 and a red for an enchantment. Whenever a non-token creature enters the battlefield under our control, flip a coin until you lose the flip. For each flip you've won, create a token that's a copy of that creature. Those tokens gain haste. Exile them at the beginning of the next end step. This card's really good because we're playing a lot of creatures with enter the battlefield effects. So if we play a creature with a very good effect, say we win 2 or 3 flips, we're going to make 2 or 3 copies, and we're going to get that ability for the original and every copy that enters the battlefield, unless we're using a legendary creature. Next enchantment is Sneak Attack. This enchantment is absolutely fantastic. Say we have a 6-mana 7/7 creature in our hand. We can pay 1 red. We can cheat that into play, and now Alena can tap for 7, and all we've done is pay 1 red. And there's a very good chance that the creature we put into play has a very, very fantastic enter the battlefield effect. So for 1 red, we get a good effect, and now our commander taps for a lot of mana. And that creature has haste. Flame Shadow Conjuring. It's an enchantment for 3 and a red. Kind of similar to Mirror March. Whenever a non-token creature enters the battlefield under our control, we can pay red. If we do, create a token that's a copy of it. Gains haste, exile at the beginning of the next end step. This doesn't have as high of an upside as Mirror March. However, it's guaranteed to make us a copy every time if we're able to pay that 1 red mana. And since we're playing creatures with good ETBs, this card's fantastic. Gets us extra triggers and more bodies to swing with during combat. Next enchantment is Teleportation Circle. 3 and a white. Enchantment: at the beginning of your end step, exile up to 1 target artifact or creature you control, then return that card to the battlefield under its owner's control. This card's obviously fantastic. Lets us flicker some of our creatures with enter the battlefield effects. They come back in, we get that effect again. There's a few artifacts in the deck that do have an enter the battlefield effect. This can also flicker those, so it's not only just going to be used on creatures. Another good enchantment is Legion's Initiative. It's 1 red and 1 white. Red creatures you control get +1/+0. White creatures you control get +0/+1. The most important part of that is the red creatures you control get +1/+0. Now, every time we play a large creature, say we play a 7/7, now it's an 8/7, so now Alena taps for 8 instead of 7. That extra mana can make a big difference. The enchantment also has an activated ability of a red and a white. Exile Legion's Initiative. Exile all creatures you control. Beginning of next combat, return them to the battlefield under their owner's control, and those creatures gain haste. This can be a really, really good way to give our creatures protection from removal spells, a board wipe. Another way it's really, really good is we can just flicker our creatures. So any ETB effects we have in play, we're going to get a lot of value there. Also, if we need to give our board haste, say we have a lot of creatures we've played in our pre-combat main phase, and we already had this enchantment down, we can pay 2. They're all going to leave the battlefield, but they're going to come back at combat. Now they all have haste. Even if we don't want to attack with them, say we just want to use some nice tapped activated abilities, we can use them on our post-combat main phase. So this card's really fantastic. Moving on to creatures. First 3 creatures I want to talk about are all really, really good value pieces. None of them have enter the battlefield effects. However, they're going to let us take advantage of all the battlefield effects we're going to talk about here in a second. First one's Eldrazi Displacer. This card's sweet. It's 3 mana for a 3/3 Eldrazi, has Devoid, and it has 2, and then specifically a colorless mana. Exile another target creature, then return it to the battlefield tapped under its owner's control. That ability is really nice because it allows us to use our enter the battlefield effects when we want at instant speed, and it also gives us some sort of protection, which is also nice. We can tap down our opponent's creatures before they go to combat, things like that. However, that one colorless can sometimes be a little tricky to pay for. It depends on what mana rocks we have on the field, what types of lands we have on the field. Sometimes, if you're going to run this card, you might want to tweak your mana base a little bit to have lands that can tap for colorless. Now, since we're running Boros, that's not really a big challenge to us because we don't need a great amount of mana fixing. But just make sure you're able to pay for that ability if you're going to include this card. The next card is Gila-Ren. It's a legendary creature for 3. It does basically the same thing as Eldrazi Displacer, except it's only able to target our creatures. And if we delay their entry till the end step, we get a Vigilance and Lifelink counter. So, good value card. Next card is Zierda. I think it's a little obvious at this point, but we're not going to be running this as a companion. Just going in the 99. The main ability here is abilities you activate that aren't mana abilities cost 2 less to activate. This effect can't reduce the mana in that cost to less than 1 mana. It also has another ability of pay 1, tap, target creature can't block this turn. I don't think I've ever used that in all of my time playing this deck. The ability reduction is the key part. It's super, super useful. It's really good for the 2 cards I just mentioned. However, Livio, having this out turns Livio into an absolute powerhouse. Both of those abilities cost just 1 white mana, which is super, super powerful. It allows you to do a lot in just 1 turn, and it can even allow the deck to combo off sometimes. Got 5 more cards with activated abilities. The first one being Jaxus, the Troublemaker. It's 4 mana for a 2/3 legendary creature. Has an activated ability of pay a red, tap, discard a card. Create a token that's a copy of another target creature you control. It gains haste, and when this creature dies, draw a card, sacrifice it at the beginning of the next end step, activate only as a sorcery. This card's super nice because it allows us to get rid of some cards that we don't really want in our hand, cycle those away, draw another card at the end step when the token dies. But more importantly, the token we're making comes in. Most likely, we copied a creature with a good enter the battlefield effect. And now, that creature entered the battlefield, so it turns on Alena for the turn. She can now tap for mana. So this card's very, very useful. It also has Blitz for 1 and a red, so if we're really tight in a game and we need to use that ability right away, and we don't need the creature later on, we can use that ability. It comes down with haste. Can use it right away, and then we sack it at the end step. Next creature is another legendary. It's Felden of the Third Path, 3 mana for a 2/3. Has an activated ability of 2 and a red, tap. Create a token that's a copy of target creature card in your graveyard, except it's an artifact in addition to its other types. Gains haste. Sack it at the beginning of the next end step. Running a lot of very good, large, powerful creatures in the deck. A lot of them are going to get killed. People are going to be using the removal on our stuff. We're playing a lot of threats. They're going to go to the graveyard. Felden's going to allow us to get some extra value off of them after they die. Use their enter the battlefield effects again. Maybe attack with them. The next card is Perforos, Bronze-Blooded. This card's not always going to be a creature. It's a 5 mana for a 7/6 Indestructible God. As long as Perforos' devotion is less than 5, it's not a creature. So, best case scenario is we play this when we have enough red permanents in play so that Perforos is a creature, because being a 7/6, it makes our commander tap for 7 mana if it's a creature, which is super nice. It also gives our other creatures haste, another great effect, and then it has an effect kind of like sneak attack. So it has pay 2 and a red. You can put a red creature card or an artifact creature card from your hand onto the battlefield, sack it at the beginning of the next end step. This card's super great because it just does so many things for our deck. It can allow us to tap for a lot of mana with our commander, gives our board haste. It can also cheat things into play. The next two cards are kind of an interesting pick. Both of these cards work really well with Livio. We have Humble Defector and Mangara of Corondor. So both of these creatures have interesting activated abilities. Humble Defector has tap, draw 2 cards. Target opponent gains control of Humble Defector. Activate this ability only during your turn. So what we can do is we can activate Humble Defector, and his entire ability goes on the stack at once. What we can do is, before his ability resolves, exile him with Livio, and now he's not in play. So when his ability resolves, we're going to draw 2 cards, and there's no Humble Defector to give to an opponent. So we're just going to maintain this card in exile, and when we need it again for some card draw, we can bring it back down with Livio's second ability. Mangara's ability works very similar to Humble Defector. Mangara has an activated ability of tap, exile Mangara, and target permanent. So what we can do is we can put this ability on the stack, and before it resolves, we can exile Mangara with Livio. Now when the ability resolves, there is no Mangara to exile, and the target for the ability is still in play, so the ability doesn't fizzle. So we're going to keep our creature, and we're going to get to exile something, and we can use this creature multiple times during the game to get rid of our opponent's stuff. Now we're going to start talking about some creatures with end of the battlefield effects. I'm not going to break all of these down in depth because it's pretty simple as to how we're going to use them. We're going to use a lot of the cards that I've already talked about to gain value, use their abilities multiple times. I'm just going to talk briefly about each one as to why I like them. Durgar Hedgemage, it's really easy to get this creature's abilities to trigger since we're only running white, and red, so we're going to have a large concentration of mountain and plains in the deck. Good removal piece. Solemn Simulacrum. It's really easy to get a lot of value off this card. Ramp a couple times. If it dies, we're going to get to draw a card. I like this one. Moonblessed Cleric. This card's really sweet. It's a tutor that in our deck's going to be repeatable to get some of the enchantments that we talked about. Also can go get Perforos. So this card's pretty awesome. The next card's a bit weird. Sandstone Oracle. When it enters the battlefield, choose an opponent. If that player has more cards in hand than you, draw cards equal to the difference. Typically, there's going to be that one player at your table that's drawn a lot of cards this game. They're probably going to have a 5, 6, 7 cards in hand. Sometimes we're making a lot of mana, so it's really easy for us to cast all of our spells, run our hand pretty dry. While this card does have a high CMC at 7, that's not really a problem for us. Like I just said, we can make a lot of mana, play a lot of spells, so this is easy to cast for us. And it's repeatable card draw that we can take advantage of with our commander. This card may read bad, but it's actually super, super good. Next one's Village Bellringer. Has flash, and when it enters the battlefield, untap all creatures you control. This one's pretty sweet because it just lets us use our commander's abilities more. And if your deck has the right cards in play, it can actually oops into a combo sometimes. If you've played a large enough creature this turn and Alena taps for a lot of mana, you can use the Urn of Godfire or Energy Refractor to make some of that into white mana, which allows Livio to exile and then return Village Bellringer to play, which untaps both of our commanders, allowing us to repeat this cycle. And then any other enter the battlefield effects we have in play, we're going to get to do any number of times we want. As far as big creatures go with enter the battlefield effects, I'm just going to talk about my favorite 3. If you actually consider building this deck, I would highly recommend going on Scryfall and finding your favorite cards, because the slot for large creatures with enter the battlefield effects is kind of interchangeable. These, I think, are just my favorite and should probably go in most decks. We have Sun Titan, Combustible Gearhulk, and Molten Primordial. Sun Titan is a 6/6 with Vigilance. When it enters or attacks, we can return target permanent card with CMC 3 or less from our graveyard to the battlefield. That's a good ETB and attack trigger, and it allows us to recur some of the cards we've been talking about throughout this video, a lot of which have enter the battlefield effects. So this can trigger its own ETB, and then we can get another ETB. A lot of value there. Combustible Gearhulk's super, super sweet. 6/6 for first strike. When it enters the battlefield, target opponent may have you draw 3 cards. If the player doesn't, you mill 3. Then Combustible Gearhulk deals damage to that player equal to the total mana value of those cards. So this can either be a way to deal a lot of damage to an opponent. We're playing a lot of expensive cards in this deck, and if an opponent doesn't want to give us those draws, sometimes they could take 8, 9, 10 damage, or we'll refill our hand. So good either way. Molten Primordial. 6/4 with haste. When it enters the battlefield, for each opponent, gain control of up to 1 target creature that player controls until end of turn. Untap those creatures, they gain haste until end of turn. This card can be a really good finisher. I've seen it come down with some of our enchantments that copy stuff. If we get multiple copies with our enchantments, sometimes we can just steal all the important creatures in play and swing out at our opponents. Otherwise, it's just a really good value card. One of the neat things that you can do with this one is once you take your opponent's creatures before the end step when they're going to get them back, you can actually exile them under Livio. Now, it kind of contradicts our game plan. However, sometimes stealing those creatures and not giving them back to our opponents is actually more important than using our commander on our own board state. Okay, so we're going to wrap up by talking about the win conditions of the deck. The deck can win through general combat. However, there are a couple cards that can allow us to win the game on the spot pretty easily without using combat. We have Comet Storm and Jaya's Emulating Inferno. Both of these spells are used in this deck as just direct damage to our opponents. However, we actually need a lot of mana to be able to kill our opponents this way. There's 3 cards in the deck that generate enough mana to allow us to burn our opponents with Giant Lightning Inferno and Comet Storm. There's Soul of Eternity, Serra Avatar, and Umbral Mantle. Soul of Eternity and Serra Avatar are basically the same card with a couple slight differences. They come down and their power and toughness is equal to our life total, which means that if our life total is greater than our opponent's, we're going to be able to produce enough red mana to burn our opponents out in one shot by activating Alena. Soul of Eternity is slightly better because it's a repeatable effect because it has Encore. So if this card dies, we can actually bring it back on another turn and use Alena to make a lot of red mana again. Serra Avatar, if it is put into the graveyard from anywhere, we shuffle it into our owner's library. So that card can't be recurred with anything, and it's not reusable unless we draw into it again. Kind of depends on what pod you're going to be playing in, if you're going to be using Umbral Mantle. If you're in a combo-friendly or slightly faster pod, you're going to want to use this card. It's 3 mana for an equipment. It has equipped creature has pay 3, tap, untap this creature. It gets +2/+2 until end of turn. It has equip cost of 0. So what we can do to make enough mana to use these burn spells is if we've played a creature with power 4 or greater and we put this onto Alena, Alena's going to tap for 4, untap for 3. So we're going to net 1 red. And Alena's going to get +2/+2. So it actually makes Alena infinitely large and we can make infinite red mana. What's nice about Umbral Mantle is that even without either of our mass burn spells, we can probably still win the game if we're able to make infinite mana. There's a lot of mana sinks in the deck, a lot of creatures with activated abilities, especially if we're able to have one of our mana filtering artifacts. It's pretty hard for our deck not to win the game on the spot once we have this artifact in play. So that pretty much sums up the entire deck. I'm not going to go into the mana base as it's basically dependent on your budget. If you're trying to build this more of a budget list, you're probably just going to go with a lot of basic lands and maybe a couple utility lands to be able to use Eldrazi Displacer. But if you're going to go with a higher budget, there's a lot more room for utility lands and just better mana fixing. And if you've made it this far into the video, thank you so much for watching. If you know of any interesting cards that you would put in the deck, please feel free to leave them in the comments. Also, if you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing, as I'll be making more Magic the Gathering content like this. Have a good day.